Ray Charles had already crossed over. By 1961, he was selling out Carnegie Hall in New York City, winning Grammy Awards, and charming white audiences across the United States of America with his blend of gospel, country, and soul. He had done what almost no black artist before him had managed to do. He had walked through the door that separated the black music world from the white mainstream, and he had walked through it with a smile, a sharp suit, and a genius that no radio programmer could deny. James Brown watched all of this from a distance, and he felt something complicated. He admired Ray Charles. Of course he did. Every serious musician in America admired Ray Charles. But admiration is never simple when you are hungry, when you are fighting for every inch of ground, when you believe with every fiber of your body that what you are doing is the most important music being made anywhere on earth. And yet the mainstream keeps looking the other way. James Brown was burning. His performances at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, New York City, had become legendary. People talked about seeing James Brown the way they talked about religious experiences. He would drop to his knees. He would spin and freeze. He would scream and beg and plead. He would drip sweat through 3 shirts in a single night. He was doing something on stage that no one had ever done before, something that went beyond singing, beyond dancing, beyond entertainment, something closer to possession, to prophecy, to the kind of raw spiritual release that could only come from a man who had survived what James Brown had survived. But the mainstream radio stations were not playing his records on their biggest shows. The television bookings that would have put him in front of millions of white American households were not coming. And the industry insiders, the tastemakers, the men in suits who decided what the country got to hear, they kept telling him the same thing, in different ways, with different words. Your sound is too raw. It was sometime in the early 1960s. During a period when both men were navigating the complicated geography of American music, that Ray Charles and James Brown found themselves in conversation. The exact details of where and when have been told differently by different people over the years, the way all important conversations eventually get told and retold until the story becomes something larger than the facts. But what was said, or what was meant, what was communicated, what landed in James Brown's chest like a stone, has been described consistently by those who knew him. Ray Charles looked at James Brown and told him something close to the truth as Ray Charles understood it. Your music, Ray said, will never cross over to white audiences. It is too raw, too black, too untamed. They will never accept it the way it is. There was no cruelty in the words, at least not intentional cruelty. Ray Charles was a man who understood the machinery of the American music industry from the inside. He had cracked the code himself. He had softened certain edges, embraced certain genres, made certain strategic decisions that had opened certain doors. He was not being dismissive. He was being practical. He was being honest in the way that only someone who has already navigated a difficult road can be honest with someone who is still standing at the beginning of it. But James Brown heard something else in those words. He heard a ceiling being installed above his head. He heard someone telling him that the way he was, the raw, screaming, spinning, kneeling, sweat-soaked, gospel-drenched way he was not enough, was too much, was wrong. James Brown had heard that before. He had heard it his whole life. He was born on May 3, 1933, in Barnwell, South Carolina. His full name was James Joseph Brown. His family was desperately poor. His mother left when he was very young. His father, Joe Brown, could not hold things together, and by the time James was around 4 or 5 years old, he was essentially being raised by an aunt named Honey in Augusta, Georgia. The house his aunt ran was not, by any conventional standard, a stable or respectable environment. It was a place where men came and went, where money was scarce, where the rules of polite society did not apply. James Brown grew up wearing potato sacks for underwear. He grew up so poor that he was sometimes sent home from school because his clothes were not adequate, not presentable enough for even the most basic standard of decency that a Depression-era Southern school could enforce. He grew up understanding, at the most fundamental level, what it meant to be told you were not enough. And so when Ray Charles, brilliant, accomplished, crossed over Ray Charles, looked at him and essentially said that his music, his sound, his rawness, his blackness was too much for the mainstream to absorb, James Brown did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He did not make a case. He smiled. And then he said one word. Watch. There is a version of this story that ends with some clean, dramatic moment. A single night when everything changed. A single television performance that shattered every prediction Ray Charles had made and left the industry speechless. And there is such a moment. It comes clearly and powerfully. But to understand what that moment meant, you have to understand the years that led up to it. After that conversation, James Brown did not change his sound. This is the thing that separates him from almost every other artist who has ever been told that their rawness is an obstacle. Almost every artist, when faced with that information, makes adjustments. They smooth out the edges. They hire different producers. They record different kinds of songs. They calculate what the market wants, and they give it something closer to that. James Brown went in the opposite direction. He got rawer. He got louder. He got more physical, more relentless, more demanding of his band, more demanding of his audiences, more demanding of himself. He developed what would eventually become the most disciplined and exacting approach to live performance that American popular music had ever seen. He fined his musicians for wrong notes. He rehearsed until the band could feel his intentions before he expressed them. He built a machine, an incredible human machine made of rhythm and sweat and absolute precision disguised as wildness, and he drove that machine harder every single night. And while he was building this machine, something was happening in the wider culture that Ray Charles, for all his genius, had not fully accounted for. The world was changing by the mid-1960s. The cultural landscape of the United States of America was in the middle of a transformation so profound that the old rules, the rules about what white audiences would accept, about what could cross over and what could not, were starting to crack. The civil rights movement was reshaping the national conversation about race, about identity, about whose culture deserved to be celebrated and whose deserved to be suppressed. Young white Americans, particularly young white Americans who had grown up listening to rock and roll, which itself had been built on the foundation of black rhythm and blues, were hungry for something more authentic, more urgent, more real than what the mainstream radio programmers were serving them. They were ready for James Brown. But James Brown did not wait for them to come to him. In October of 1962, James Brown did something that no black artist in his position had ever done before. He rented the Apollo Theater in Harlem, New York City, rented it himself with his own money, because his record label King Records did not believe a live album recorded at a black venue could sell enough copies to justify the investment. And he recorded what would become one of the most important live albums in the history of American music. Live at the Apollo, James Brown had to fight to get it released. He had to argue with his label. He had to essentially force the issue, because the industry did not believe that a raw, unfiltered recording of a black artist performing for a black audience could find a mainstream audience. The industry had internalized the same logic that Ray Charles had expressed to James Brown privately. The rawness was the problem. The blackness was the problem. These were things to be managed, softened, translated before presenting to the mainstream. James Brown disagreed. Live at the Apollo was released in 1963. It climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Pop Albums chart. The pop chart, not the rhythm and blues chart. The chart that measured sales across all audiences, white and black alike. It stayed on the charts for 66 weeks. It sold over 1 million copies at a time, when selling 1 million copies of any album was considered an extraordinary achievement, and selling 1 million copies of a live soul album recorded at a black venue in Harlem was considered, by most industry professionals, essentially impossible. The mainstream had not rejected James Brown's rawness. The mainstream had been waiting for it. But the single most dramatic proof of everything that James Brown had said with that one word, "Watch," came on a cold night in November of 1964, when James Brown appeared on national television in a way that changed the conversation permanently. The context matters. The program was a nationally broadcast concert special, the kind of television event that put an artist in front of millions of American households simultaneously. This was not a nightclub booking. This was not a regional tour. This was the kind of platform that, in 1964, could make or break a career's relationship with the American mainstream in a single evening. James Brown had been told, in various ways, by various people, that he needed to understand his audience, that he needed to calibrate his performance for the living rooms of white America, that the church-drenched, physically ecstatic, raw emotional power of what he did at the Apollo would not translate, would not communicate, would not be received. He'd walked out onto that stage, and he did not calibrate anything. He performed with everything he had. He hit the first note, and the band locked in with the kind of precision that looked like chaos, but was in fact the result of hundreds of hours of rehearsal, thousands of miles of touring, a level of professional discipline that would have impressed a military commander. He spun. He froze. He dropped to his knees on a hardwood stage in front of the cameras of a national television network, and he begged with his whole body, his whole voice, his whole history. The studio audience, which included a significant number of white Americans who had come expecting to see a performance, found themselves doing something they had not planned to do. They went completely out of their minds. The response was not polite. It was not measured. It was not the kind of restrained appreciation that well-behaved television audiences were supposed to demonstrate. People screamed. People grabbed each other. People stood up and would not sit back down. The energy in that studio was so raw and so total that the cameras kept cutting to audience members who looked like they had been struck by something they did not have a word for. The switchboard at the network lit up afterward. The critics who had been prepared to explain why James Brown's approach would not translate found themselves writing different articles than they had planned. And somewhere, Ray Charles, who was a man of genuine brilliance and genuine honesty, had to reckon with the fact that the prediction he had made, the ceiling he had described, the limitation he had identified with such confidence, had been demolished in a single evening on national television. James Brown had not crossed over by becoming something other than what he was. He had crossed over by being more completely what he was than anyone had thought was possible or acceptable. This is the part of the story that gets lost when people tell it quickly. The narrative of James Brown proving Ray Charles wrong is satisfying because it fits the template of a rivalry, of a prediction met with defiance, of a ceiling shattered by a man who refused to accept it. And all of that is true. But the deeper truth is stranger and more interesting and more important. Ray Charles was not entirely wrong. He was looking at the America that existed in the early 1960s and making an accurate assessment of its limitations. White mainstream audiences at that moment really were less ready for raw, unfiltered black musical expression than they would be 5 years later. Ray Charles was reading the room correctly. What he could not account for was that James Brown was not going to wait for the room to be ready. James Brown was going to change the room. The mechanism by which he did this was not strategy, exactly. It was not calculation. It was something closer to the opposite of calculation. While Ray Charles had approached the challenge of crossing over as a puzzle to be solved, which genres to incorporate, which edges to soften, which audiences to court, James Brown approached it as a question of faith. He believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who has nothing left to lose, that if he could get people into the room, if he could get them to actually experience what he was doing, the rawness that everyone was warning him about would become the very thing that converted them. He was right. And the rightness of it changed the shape of American music permanently. The years that followed that national television performance unfolded in a way that nobody in the industry had fully predicted. James Brown did not become a crossover artist in the traditional sense. He did not start making music that sounded like what white radio was already playing. Instead, white radio started changing to accommodate music that sounded more like what James Brown had always been making. The rhythmic innovations, the emphasis on the one, the call and response, the sheer physicality of the sound. These things began to move from the edges of American music toward the center. By the time he recorded Papa's Got a Brand New Bag in 1965, which would win him his first Grammy Award, the argument was essentially over. The argument was not just over in the sense that James Brown had succeeded commercially, though he had. The argument was over in the deeper sense that the terms of the debate had shifted. The question was no longer whether raw, black musical expression could cross over to white audiences. The question was whether white audiences could keep up. Funk, which James Brown effectively invented, or at least codified and named and brought to its fullest expression, would go on to become one of the foundational languages of popular music worldwide. Hip hop, which emerged in New York City in the 1970s and became the dominant global popular music form of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, was built on samples and structures and rhythmic concepts that James Brown and his bands had developed. The most sampled musician in history. That is what James Brown became. His music was not too raw for anyone. It was the raw material. Ray Charles and James Brown did not become enemies. Their relationship was complicated and mutual and shot through with the kind of respect that only people who are genuinely operating at the highest level can feel for each other. They were two black men from the American South who had grown up in poverty and violence and deprivation and had somehow, through will and genius and an almost incomprehensible capacity for work, made themselves into figures whose music would outlast them both. Ray Charles would go on to one of the most remarkable careers in American music history. His crossing over, his decision to engage with country music, to broaden his sonic vocabulary, to meet certain parts of the mainstream on their own terms, was not a compromise. It was its own kind of genius. Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music, which he released in 1962, was one of the most audacious artistic moves of its era. It was the work of a man who understood that the walls between musical genres were artificial, that beauty did not belong to any one tradition. That a man who could hear everything could make anything. But James Brown had made a different argument. And the argument James Brown had made had also turned out to be true. You did not have to soften yourself. You did not have to translate yourself. You did not have to sand down the raw edges of who you were and what you came from in order to reach people. You could reach them with the fullness of yourself with the rawness intact, with all the history and pain and joy and fury that had made you who you were. And if you were real enough, if you were committed enough, if you were disciplined enough in your wildness, they would come to you. They would come to you screaming. James Brown spent his whole career proving this. He proved it at the Apollo in 1962. He proved it on national television in 1964. He proved it again at every subsequent stop on a touring schedule that was so relentless it bordered on self-destruction. He proved it in the way that his music echoed through every decade that followed, getting louder and more influential with time rather than quieter. He proved it with the entirety of his life. And somewhere in that life, in all those decades of performance and argument and proof, was the echo of a conversation that happened in the early 1960s. When a man who had already crossed over looked at a man who was still on the other side and told him it could not be done the way he was planning to do it. James Brown had smiled. He had said one word, and then he had gone back to rehearsal and turned up everything. The volume, the intensity, the rawness, the faith, until the ceiling that had been described to him dissolved, until the prediction that had been made about him became one of the great wrong predictions in the history of American music, until the one word he had spoken became not just a response, but a legacy, not just a rebuttal, but a revolution. "Watch," he had said, and the world had watched. And what the world had seen, what it had felt in its chest and its knees and its nerve endings, when James Brown finally appeared on that national stage and refused to be anything other than exactly what he was. Too raw, too real, too complete, too alive, was not a crossover. It was a takeover. And nobody who was in the room that night, nobody who watched it on television, nobody who heard the recording, nobody who felt the reverberations of that moment moving through the decades of music that followed, could ever again honestly claim that James Brown's music was too raw for anyone. It was raw enough for everyone. It was raw enough to change the world.